Hello, and welcome to another LPJ Models build video. I'm going to be looking at the 148 Eduard Bf109 G-2 from the limited edition Mersu boxing, with markings for aircraft in Finnish service during World War II. I have always liked the look of the more unusual Bf109 camouflage schemes, so it was an easy choice to choose Scheme D with a menacing green and black camo. The build started in the cockpit as usual. This area is very nicely detailed, with photo etched parts supplied as standard. When I had finished the main construction of the cockpit, it was primed with Mission Models grey primer. This is best applied in wet coats, and the result is ultra smooth. To help add extra depth in the cockpit, it was painted in an even coat of black. The main colour in the tub was RLM 66, thin 70 to 30 paint to thinners. This was sprayed carefully to look like the natural shading you would see in a cockpit. The deepest areas of the cockpit were left in a darker shade by applying less paint in those areas. The highlights were created by increasing the layers of paint until they looked suitably lighter. The next step was to carefully glue on the pre-coloured photo etched parts. I used Deluxe Materials Rocket Rapid, a medium viscosity superglue with a slow setting time, giving me lots of time to position the parts. A slower setting superglue can help with parts that need lining up perfectly, like this instrument panel. The cockpit details were painted with Vallejo acrylic paints. I painted them white first to help the colours pop a little better. For detail painting, I always use a Kolinsky sable brush, usually in a 2.0 size, in either Pro Art Series 2A Designer or Raphael 8404. I painted the shaft of the control column with a Molotov 1mm liquid chrome marker. This great pen gives you a realistic metal finish with minimal effort. Now that all of the details have been carefully painted, it's time for a varnish and weathering. For the varnish, I like to use Alclad Aquagloss as it provides a high shine, durable finish and it doesn't need thinning. The chipping in the cockpit was done with a sponge and Citadel Stormhost Silver. The key is to dab most of the paint away on a paper towel before chipping your model. I used the AK panel liner for grey and blue camouflage and AK landing gear wash to add extra depth and grime to the cockpit. Winsor & Newton Professional Matte Varnish was sprayed slightly thinned with water to give the cockpit a nice flat finish. The fuel pipe is supplied as a clear piece. The transparent section was masked with Tamiya masking tape for curves and it was coated with a layer of Michelin Models RLM04 Gelb. The details on the pipe were painted and it was carefully glued in place with super glue. The seat belts were assembled before bending to shape. I used Rocket Rapid super glue for this. Once everything was assembled and sealed with matte varnish, the cockpit tub was glued into the fuselage. The tail wheel well was sprayed with RLM02 and the details on the tail wheel were picked out with the Molotov chrome marker and Vallejo acrylics. I will protect this assembly with masking tape before I start painting properly. The fuselage halves were glued together. Before the glue had properly dried, I ran some more glue into the seams and squeezed them to make sure they were properly joined. It's easier to sand away the oozed styrene than spend lots of time filling gaps with putty. The photo etch parts on the air filter were annealed and rolled to the correct shape around a paintbrush handle. The construction of the aircraft was fairly straightforward, and I needed very little putty for the build. The elevators were positioned slightly downwards to add a little bit of visual interest to the build. I used Mr. Hobby Mr. Cement Deluxe for the wings. This glue has a slightly longer working time, giving me more time to line things up properly. I posed the slats open and glued the ailerons in at slight angles. The oil cooler has some great detail. This was painted in RLM02 and the grills were lightly brushed with Citadel Ironbreaker. This was then given a wash with the AK landing gear wash. I didn't glue the oil cooler into place. It was just pushed in to allow me to install the exhausts later on. The inside of the radiator cavity was painted in the underside colour RLM65. I glued the flaps and the radiator flaps in the down position. It's essential to make sure there is no paint on the gluing surfaces. This will make sure they won't fall off later on. The gun sight was glued on just before the canopy. I find it easier to glue on delicate parts at the last possible moment. There's less chance of knocking them off and losing them to the carpet monster. The canopy was masked with the supplied Eduard laser cut tape masks. It was then sprayed with the cockpit colour RLM66 to simulate the inside framing. The entire airframe was primed with 2 wet coats of LPJ Models grey primer. As you can see, it goes down very smooth. After priming is a perfect time to look for and fix imperfections on your model, like this grim seam line. Time for the best bit, the painting. LPJ Models Black was mixed with a small amount of their polymixative and thinner and sprayed over the whole model, ready for black basing. The wheel wells were carefully freehanded with RLM02. The black basing was started with RLM65 mixed 60-40 with LPJ Models thinner. The idea with black basing is to build your paint opacity up in a random manner letting you shade and give life to your paintwork without it looking forced. The airbrushes I'm using are a Harder and Steenbeck Infinity 0.2 and an Iwata HPB Plus 0.2 at around 20 psi. The rudder was painted in standard German camo. RLM 75 was modelled carefully over RLM 76. Mission Models Russian Dark Olive Faded was the closest FS match for the Finnish Camouflage Green. When I had finished the green coat, I masked and painted different panels with a few different mixes of Russian Dark Olive Faded, RLM 04 Yellow and Black to add more tonal variety to the model. This effect was kept very subtle. I can add more with oils later if I need to. The black camouflage was mixed from Mission Models Black, Japanese Propeller Brown and RLM 66 Dark Grey. I chose to mix my own black as I felt a true black would have looked too stark. Using an air pressure of around 20 psi, I freehanded the outlines of the camouflage, making sure my lines were crisp, and then carefully filled in the inner sections. The underside colour wrapped around the wings a little. This was carefully freehanded with my 0.2 Iwata HPB Plus. The ID bands were masked with Tamiya masking tape and primed with Mission Models white primer. The white was lightly post-shaded with brown. If you use black, the contrast can be too pronounced, especially under colours like red and yellow. The yellow was built up with wet coats of RLM 04, being careful not to hide the shading work. My favourite gloss coat is Alclad Aqua Gloss. It's strong, sprays well and goes down smoothly. I sprayed a few wet coats of aqua gloss to prepare the model for decals. The Finnish insignia decals in the model were quite thick despite being made by Cartograph. I prepared the area to be decaled with microset before applying them, and when they were dry I had to use a few coats of microsol to get them to settle nicely. The decals were sealed with a coat of aquagloss and then covered with a layer of matte varnish. When this was dry, I used Vallejo colours to chip the base colours with a 2-0 sable brush. The wing roots were chipped with Citadel iron breaker. I sprayed a coat of aquagloss on the model to protect the chipping and prepare the surface for washes. On the green areas of the model, I used the AK panel liner for green and brown camouflage. When it was dry, most of it was removed with a cotton bud, leaving the wash in the rivets and panel lines. I used a mix of titanium white, burnt umber and yellow ochre artist oil paints as a wash over the black areas on the model. The underside was washed with AK panel liner for grey and blue camo. To give the next lot of oil paints something to grip onto, I coated the model in a layer of Winsor & Newton Artist Matte Varnish thinned with water. Using a few different mixes of alizarin green, sap green and lemon yellow, I added some more panel variation on the upper surfaces of the model, using very thin transparent coats, also known as filters. I used a mix of burnt umber and French ultramarine oils to make a dark colour, and use this sparingly to add extra shading along select panel lines. Over the RLM65, I used a mix of titanium white, French ultramarine and lamp black artist oils to add some more tonal variation. The exhaust pipes were primed with Mr. Colour GX2, a high gloss black in preparation for Alclad. The exhausts were first coated in a layer of Alclad magnesium. This was followed by Alclad pale burnt metal sprayed only on the exhaust stubs to simulate heat staining. Alclad burnt iron was then sprayed carefully on the end of the stubs. And then very carefully I sprayed Alclad jet exhaust on the very tips to simulate soot. The weathering on the exhaust was taken a step further with an application of the Life Colour Deep Rust pigment wash. This was worked into the recesses and then carefully removed with their thinner. I then glazed the exhausts slightly with Life Colour Blue Burned Exhaust. I finally sprayed a little more matte black on the ends of the exhausts and they were ready to be installed. Leaving the oil cooler off earlier in the build allowed me to paint and weather the exhausts without having to mask anything. The flash suppressors were glued on with Rocket superglue. Once again, the Molotov chrome marker came in really handy for painting the undercarriage. I decided that the undercarriage was looking a little bare, so I decided to scratch build some brake lines with Plus model 0.3mm lead wire. The brake lines were painted with Vallejo black. When this was dry, the whole landing gear assembly was treated to a wash with the AK landing gear wash. I carefully removed the excess, leaving the wash only in the deepest crevices. I made some mud effects on the landing gear doors with the Artist Oils Titanium White, French Ultramarine, Burnt Umber and Yellow Ochre, mixed in different proportions. I decided to use chipping fluid on the propeller. Over Alclad aluminium, I sprayed a few light coats of AK Worn Effects. The propeller was painted with a mix of Mission Models RLM70 and black. When this had dried, I slightly wet the surface, activating the chipping fluid, and carefully scratched away the paint, leaving bare metal showing through. The mud and dust on the wheels were mixed from the same colours I used earlier. The landing gear was glued on with Tamiya Extra Thin Cement Quick Setting. The wheels were then attached with a little drop of superglue. The paint masks were carefully removed from the canopy. The final detail that I added was the aerial wire. I used Jussi van der Rosten to rig that thing. This was attached with superglue on the tail end of the aircraft. When the glue had set, I stretched it across to the aerial by the canopy and glued it carefully into place. Finally, I simulated the ceramic beads on the aerial wire with Vallejo white acrylic. And there you have it, the Eduard 148 Bf109 G-2 in Finnish markings. I really enjoyed this build and I hope you did too. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the video, and also stay tuned for more content from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.